Clara Whitmore threw the wedding dress against the wall and watched it crumple to the floor like something that had died. "I won't marry a man I've never met," she said, her voice breaking. "You're selling me, Papa. At least have the decency to say it out loud." Her father couldn't lift his eyes to hers. "I'm saving this family by handing me to Nathaniel Brooks, the man this whole valley crosses the street to avoid." In the bitter winter of 1885, Clara Whitmore was certain her life was ending. She had no idea how wrong she was. Before we begin, please subscribe, follow Clara's story all the way to the end, and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story travels. The dress lay on the floor between them, and neither one moved to pick it up. Clara stood with her arms crossed tight over her chest because if she let them fall to her side, she was afraid they would start shaking, and she refused to let her father see her shake. She was 21 years old. She had buried a mother, nursed a sick brother through 2 hard winters, and pulled a plow herself when the mule went lame. She had never once cried in front of the man who raised her. She would not start tonight. "Say something," she said. Her father, Amos Whitmore, sat at the kitchen table with his hands folded around a tin cup that had gone cold an hour ago. He was 54 and looked 70. The drought had done that to him. The debt had done the rest. "There is nothing to say that will make it hurt less, Clara." "Then say the thing that's true. Say you had no right." He flinched, and she hated that it gave her a small, ugly satisfaction to watch it land. "I had every right," he said quietly. "You're my daughter. I'm your daughter, not your property, not a heifer you trade at market when the year goes bad." "Clara, how much?" She stepped closer to the table. "I want to hear the number, Papa. How much am I worth? What's the exact price you got for me?" Amos's jaw worked. For a long moment, he said nothing at all, and the silence in that room was so complete she could hear the wind trying to find its way through the gaps in the walls. $400 in back taxes, he said finally. "The note on the Northfield, the doctor's bills from when your brother took the fever, and the loan from the bank in Willow Creek that comes due in 9 days. He looked up at her and his eyes were wet, and she hated that too. 9 days, Clara. 9 days and they take the land. They take the house. They put the 4 of us out on the road in the middle of January with nothing. So you sold me instead." "So a man offered to erase every last cent of it," he said. "Every note, every debt. He offered to clear all of it and give us the deed free and clear. And all he asked in return was a wife." Her voice came out flat. "He asked for a wife the way you'd ask for a length of rope from the general store." "Clara, that is exactly what it is." She turned away from him so he wouldn't see her face. "Do you even know this man? Have you ever spoken more than 10 words to Nathaniel Brooks in your whole life?" Amos hesitated, and the hesitation told her everything. "You haven't," she breathed. "You handed me to a stranger. A stranger everyone in this county is terrified of. People say things. People say he buried 2 ranch hands out behind his barn and never told the sheriff. People say he ran a man off his land at gunpoint for stepping across the property line. People say his own foreman is scared to look him in the eye." She spun back around. "That's who you gave me to Papa. That's the man whose house I'm supposed to live in, whose bed I'm supposed to—" "Stop." Amos stood up so fast the chair scraped hard against the floor. "You think I don't lie awake with that? You think I haven't hated myself every single night since I signed my name? Then unsign it." "I can't." His voice cracked down the middle. "God help me, Clara, I can't. It's done. The papers are witnessed. And if I break it, we lose everything, and this time there is no rich rancher waiting to pull us out of the hole. There's just the road and the cold, and your little brother who's still not strong from the fever." He pressed a hand over his mouth for a moment, gathering himself. "I made a devil's bargain. I know it. But I made it so the 3 of you would have a roof. And the only one who has to pay for it is me, because I'll carry what I did to you until the day I die." Clara stared at him. She wanted to keep being angry. Anger was clean and simple, and it kept the fear from swallowing her whole. But standing there watching her father come apart in the middle of the kitchen, she felt the anger crack, and underneath it was something so much worse. Terror. Because it was real now. It wasn't a threat or a rumor. In 2 days, she would climb into a wagon and be carried out to Brooks Ranch, and she would belong to a man she had never met, and there would be no one out there to hear her if she screamed. "When?" she said. Amos wiped his face with the back of his hand. The day after tomorrow. He's sending a man with a wagon at first light. He didn't even come himself. No. Of course not. She laughed, and it was a terrible sound, not really a laugh at all. Why would he? You don't ride out to inspect a thing you've already bought. She didn't sleep that night. She sat up in the loft where she and her 9-year-old brother Toby shared a straw tick, and she listened to him breathe, and she thought about all the ways a woman could disappear on the frontier and never be found. Toby stirred beside her sometime after midnight. Clara, his voice was small in the dark. Are you really going away? She hadn't known he was awake. She hadn't wanted him to hear any of it. Go back to sleep, Toby. Bess Coleman says the Brooks man is a killer. His hand found her sleeve and held on. She says he's got eyes like a wolf and he never smiles. And if you make him mad, he'll... Bess Coleman is a foolish girl who repeats things she doesn't understand. Clara said more sharply than she meant to. Then softer. Nobody's going to hurt me, I promise. It was the first lie she had ever told him. Will you come back? She stroked his hair the way their mother used to. Whenever I can, and when I can't come to you, you'll come to me. You'll ride out and eat at a fine table, and I'll spoil you rotten. How's that? Toby was quiet for a while. I don't want you to go, he whispered. I know, sweet boy. She pressed her lips to the top of his head so he wouldn't feel her chin trembling. I know. The wagon came at first light exactly as promised. Clara had one small trunk. Everything she owned in the world fit inside it with room to spare, and somehow that made the whole thing worse that a life could be packed up so small. She stood on the porch in her mother's good gray dress with the trunk at her feet and watched the wagon roll up the frozen track toward the house. The man driving it was old and lean and weather-beaten with a gray mustache and eyes that had seen a great deal and been surprised by very little. He climbed down slow, favoring one leg. Miss Whitmore? Yes. Name's Elias. I run the stables out at the ranch. He touched the brim of his hat. Mr. Brooks sent me to fetch you. Did he? Clara kept her chin high. And where's Mr. Brooks? Working. Elias said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Man's got 200 head of cattle and a storm coming. He don't get days off, ma'am, not even for this. How considerate of him to make his intentions clear before I've even left my father's porch. Elias looked at her for a long moment. Something in his weathered face softened, though it was hard to say what. You've got a sharp tongue, he said. That's good. You'll need it out here. He bent groaning and lifted her trunk before she could stop him. Say your goodbyes, miss. We've a long ride, and I'd like to beat the weather. Her father came out onto the porch then. He stood there in the cold with his hat in his hands, and he opened his mouth and nothing came out. Don't, Clara said. Whatever you're going to say, Papa, don't. I can't carry it and do this at the same time. Amos closed his mouth. He nodded. Toby ran out past his father's legs and threw his arms around her waist so hard it knocked the breath out of her, and he didn't say anything. He just held on, and Clara held him back and stared over his head at the gray sky and did not cry, did not cry, did not cry. Then she pried his arms loose, and she climbed up onto the wagon bench beside Elias, and she looked straight ahead as they pulled away, because she knew if she looked back once, she would never be able to go through with it. The ride took 4 hours. For the first hour, Clara said nothing. Neither did Elias. He seemed like a man perfectly comfortable with silence, which was more than she could say for most. It was Clara who finally broke it because the questions had been building in her chest until she thought they might choke her. Is it true, she asked, what they say about him? Elias didn't take his eyes off the track. What do they say? That he's dangerous? That he's hurt people? That the last person who crossed him disappeared? Elias was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful. I've worked for Nathaniel Brooks 11 years, Miss Whitmore. Longer than any man on that ranch. And in 11 years, I have seen him do a great many hard things. He clicked his tongue at the horses. But I have never once seen him do a cruel one. Those two ain't the same, though folks around here can't seem to tell the difference. That's not an answer. It's the only honest one I've got. He glanced sideways at her. You're scared. I understand that. I'd be scared too in your boots. But I'll tell you this for free, and then I'll leave you to make up your own mind. He paused. Whatever you think you're riding toward, you're wrong about it. I don't know how yet. But you are. Clara didn't know what to do with that, so she folded her hands in her lap and said nothing, and she watched the country grow wilder and emptier around them, and she felt the last thread connecting her to her old life stretch thin and finally snap somewhere behind her on the road. Brooks Ranch was bigger than she expected. Not grander, she had imagined something out of a storybook, all white columns and glass the way rich men lived in the stories. It wasn't that at all. It was a working ranch built solid and plain, and there were men everywhere moving cattle, mending fence, hauling feed against the coming storm. They stopped what they were doing when the wagon rolled in. They watched her the way people watch a thing they've heard about but never seen. Clara held her spine straight and refused to shrink under it. Elias brought the wagon to a stop in front of the main house and set the brake. "He'll be along," he said. "Go on inside where it's warm. Nobody in that house will lay a hand on you. You have my word, and my word is worth something out here, even if his name scares you." Clara climbed down on her own. She would not be helped. The inside of the house was clean, spare, and cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. It was the coldness of a place where no woman had lived in a very long time. There were no curtains, no small comforts, a man's boots by the door, a rifle over the mantel, a table set for one. She was still standing in the middle of it, taking it in, when the door opened behind her and a man's voice said, "You're here." She turned, and every rumor she had carried for 2 days died in her throat. Nathaniel Brooks was tall, that part was true, broad through the shoulders with dark hair going gray at the temples and a face that had been hard used by weather and years. He was perhaps 35. There was a stillness to him that she had been told to fear away, of standing so quietly it made the room feel smaller. But his eyes. She had been told he had a killer's eyes. Wolf's eyes, eyes that would look at a woman and see a thing to be owned. The eyes that looked at her now were tired and careful, and she would not have believed it if she hadn't seen it, a little afraid. Not afraid of her, afraid of the whole situation. Afraid, she realized, with a jolt of frightening her. "Mr. Brooks," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Miss Whitmore." He didn't come any closer. He stayed by the door, hat in his hands, keeping the whole width of the room between them, and only later would she understand that he did it on purpose. "You had a long ride. Elias should have offered you water. I'll see he does better." "I don't want water. I want to understand what's happening to me." Something crossed his face, not anger. Almost relief, as though he'd been dreading a woman who wouldn't say what she meant, and here was one who would. "That's fair," he said. He set his hat on the table. "Then I'll tell you plainly, and you can hate me for it if you want, but you'll have the truth." He drew a breath. "Your father was going to lose everything. I had the means to stop it. I paid his debts. In exchange, he agreed that you would come here and be my wife. I know all that. I've known it for 2 days. That's not what I asked." "I know it's not." He met her eyes. "You want to know what I expect from you? What I'm going to make you do?" Clara's throat went dry. "Yes." Nathaniel Brooks was silent for a long moment, and then he said the words that would stay with her for the rest of her life. "Nothing," he said. "I'm not going to make you do anything." She thought she had misheard. "I don't understand." "I know how it looks," he said. "A man with money buys himself a wife off a desperate father. I know what you were told about me on the way here. I know what you've been picturing since the moment your father signed those papers." He shook his head slowly. "It's not going to be like that. Not in this house." "Then why?" The word came out of her almost angry. "Why go to all that trouble? Why pay a fortune to bring a stranger into your home if you don't intend to make her a wife?" "Because your father needed a way out that let him keep his pride," Nathaniel said. "And because I need a name on a paper for reasons of my own that have nothing to do with you. And because—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. For the first time, the careful stillness cracked, and underneath it, she saw something raw. "Because I have been alone in this house for 11 years, Miss Whitmore, and I told myself that was fine, that I preferred it, and I have gotten very good at lying to myself." Clara didn't move. She barely breathed. "You'll have your own room," he went on, gathering himself back up, folding the rawness away like a man who'd shown too much and regretted it. "Your own door with your own lock, and I'll be the one to give you the key. You'll go where you please and speak to whom you please. If you want to leave in the spring, I'll send you home with money enough that you'll never want for anything, and I'll keep your father's debts cleared regardless. That was the bargain, and it stands whether you stay or go. He picked his hat back up. This marriage can only survive if you choose it, and I will never once ask you to give me something your heart doesn't want to give. Then he put his hat on and he touched the brim, and he walked back out into the cold to see to his cattle before the storm hit, leaving Clara Whitmore standing alone in the middle of the coldest house she had ever entered, feeling as though the ground had shifted under her feet. She did not sleep that first night either, but for an entirely different reason. She lay in the narrow bed in the room he'd given her with the key he'd handed her clutched in her fist, and she turned the day over and over in her mind, looking for the trap in it. There had to be a trap. Men like Nathaniel Brooks did not spend fortunes for nothing. Kindness was a hook, her mother used to say, and there was always a barb inside it. She had locked her door, she had checked it twice, and nothing had come. No footsteps in the hall, no hand on the latch, nothing but the wind and the low sound of the storm rolling in over the valley, and once very late, the sound of a man's boots crossing the porch, and pausing outside, not at her door but at the front, and then the soft thud of something being set down. In the morning she found it. A stack of wool blankets folded neat left just outside her door. There was no note. There was no explanation. There was only the plain fact of them left there in the freezing dark by a man who had noticed without being told that the room he'd given her caught the worst of the north wind. Clara stood there in the cold hallway looking down at them for a long time. "It doesn't mean anything," she said aloud to no one. "Kindness isn't love. It's just a hook." But her voice didn't sound as certain as it had 2 days ago. The days that followed did not go the way she had braced herself for. Clara had prepared to be a prisoner. She had prepared to be watched, controlled, and cornered. She had built up walls a mile high, and she stood behind them, ready for the siege. The siege never came. Instead, she was simply left alone. Nathaniel rose before the sun and worked until after dark, and when their paths crossed, he was courteous and quiet and kept his distance. He did not touch her. He did not so much as let his hand brush hers when he passed her the salted supper, the one meal they shared, and only because she chose to come to the table. At first, she took it as coldness. Then slowly she began to understand it was the opposite. It was care. He was giving her so much room that she couldn't help but notice the size of the space he was making. She hated how much it confused her. "You're not eating," he observed one evening the 4th or 5th night. It was nearly the only thing he'd said all supper. "I'm not hungry." "You said that yesterday too?" He didn't push. He just set down his fork. "There's a woman in Willow Creek makes preserves you might like. Peach, I could send Elias for some, if you'd eat." "I don't need you to bribe me into eating Mr. Brooks." "No," he agreed. "You don't need anything from me. You've made that clear, and I respect it." He stood, gathered his plate, and paused. "I'd just rather you didn't waste away out of spite, that's all. Spite's a poor reason to go hungry." And despite herself, despite 2 days of terror, and 4 hours of dread, and a lifetime of being told that men like him ate women like her alive, Clara Whitmore felt the corner of her mouth twitch. She caught it before it became a smile. But he saw it. She knew he saw it because something eased in his face just for a second before he carried his plate away. That night she ate. She told herself it was because she was hungry. The trouble started on the 8th day. Clara had begun almost without deciding to make the house less of a tomb. She'd found curtains folded away in a trunk and hung them. She'd scrubbed the windows. She'd started keeping the fire going in the front room so the whole place didn't feel like a cellar. She told herself she was doing it for her own sanity, not for him, and that was half true. She was hanging the last curtain when the shouting started outside. She went to the window. There were 3 men on horseback at the edge of the yard, and they hadn't dismounted, which even Clara knew was its own kind of insult. The man in front was heavy-set and finely dressed in a way that looked wrong out here, like a coat that had wandered off from a city and gotten lost. Nathaniel walked out to meet them alone. Clara couldn't hear the words at first through the glass, but she could read the postures, and the postures told a story, the mounted man leaning down with a sneer. Nathaniel standing flat-footed and still refusing to give an inch of ground. She cracked the window an inch. The cold poured in. She didn't care. "Being neighborly, Brooks," the heavy-set man was saying. "I'm giving you the courtesy of hearing it from me first. That north section was never surveyed proper. My lawyers looked into it. Turns out the original claim was flawed. Turns out it's mine. The north section has been Brooks land for 30 years, Nathaniel said. His voice was low and even. My father cleared it. My father's buried on it. Sentiment won't hold up in a courtroom, son. The man straightened in his saddle. Name's Harlan Vance. You'll be seeing a great deal of me. I'd advise you to think hard about selling the whole spread at a fair price before the courts decide you don't own any of it and you're left with nothing at all. Man in your position. New wife to think of and all. He smiled, and it was an ugly smile. Wouldn't want her to end up back where you found her, on some dirt farm in debt. Clara's hands curled into fists on the windowsill. Nathaniel didn't move. You're on my land, Vance, he said. You've said your piece, now get off it. I'll go where I please, boy. Won't be your land much longer. And then Clara would remember. This part exactly would replay it 100 times in the nights to come. Nathaniel Brooks took one single step forward. That was all. One step. He didn't raise a hand. He didn't reach for a gun. He simply took one step, and there was something in the way he did it, some absolute stillness underneath, that made all three horses shy back and made Harlan Vance's smile falter, and made the two hired men glance at each other. Off, Nathaniel said, quietly. They went. Clara watched them ride out, and she watched Nathaniel stand there long after they'd gone alone in the middle of his yard with his shoulders set against something far heavier than the wind. And she understood all at once that she had been looking at this man wrong from the very beginning. She had thought she'd been brought here to survive Nathaniel Brooks. She was starting to wonder if Nathaniel Brooks was the one who'd been surviving alone for 11 years with the whole valley against him and no one at his back, and whether he even knew how to let anyone stand there. He came inside a long while later after the light had started to fail. He stopped short when he saw the curtains, the clean windows, the fire she'd built up in the hearth. He stood in the doorway of his own house and looked at it like a man who'd walked into the wrong life by mistake. You did this, he said. It wasn't a question. The house was cold. Clara wiped her hands on her apron, suddenly self-conscious. Not the weather, the other kind of cold. I couldn't stand it. She lifted her chin, ready to defend herself. If you don't like it, I like it. He said it fast, almost too fast, like the words got away from him. Then quieter, I like it very much. He looked around the room again and something moved behind his eyes that she didn't have a name for yet. It hasn't looked like this since. He stopped himself. Since when? Doesn't matter. It matters to me, Clara heard herself say, and was surprised to find she meant it. Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment. The firelight moved across his hard, tired face. Since my mother was alive, he said finally, she was the last one who ever tried to make it look like a home. After she passed, I stopped seeing the point. He set his hat down. Turns out there was a point. I just forgot what it was. Clara didn't know what to say to that. So she said the thing that had been sitting in her chest since the window. That man, Vance, he's going to try to take your land. Yes. Can he? Nathaniel was quiet. I don't know, he admitted, and she could tell it cost him something to say it out loud to her, to anyone. He's got money and lawyers and half the county judges owing him favors. And I've got, he gestured vaguely at the walls, this, and 30 years of my family being buried in that north field. That's supposed to count for something. But sentiment doesn't hold up in a courtroom. He's right about that much. Then you fight him with more than sentiment. He looked at her sharply. You keep records, Clara said. It wasn't a question either. She'd seen the ledgers, the stacks of papers in the study she wasn't supposed to have looked at but had. Deeds, surveys, tax receipts going back years. My father lost everything, partly because he never kept a single scrap of paper he didn't have to. But you keep all of it. I've seen it. You've been in my study. I've been in every room in this house, Mr. Brooks. I live here now. Remember, you bought me. She said it to sting him, an old habit, and watched it land, and to her own surprise felt a small flush of shame for it. She softened. The point is, you have more than sentiment. You have proof if it's in order. Is it in order? Nathaniel studied her with a new expression, one she hadn't seen from him before. It took her a moment to place it because no man had ever looked at her quite that way in her whole life. He was looking at her like she was useful, like she was clever, like her mind was a thing worth having in the room. I don't rightly know if it's in order, he said slowly. I keep everything. I've never had cause to sort through it. Never had reason to think anyone would come at me over that land. Then that's where we start, Clara said, and she heard the word come out of her own mouth, we, and she froze because she had not meant to say it, and there it was hanging in the warm air between them. Nathaniel heard it too. She saw him hear it. He didn't remark on it. He was too careful a man for that. But something changed in his face, quiet and enormous, like a door opening a crack in a house that had been sealed shut for 11 years. All right, he said softly. We start there. Bisty. That night, for the first time since she'd come to Brooks Ranch, Clara did not lock her door. She wasn't sure why. She lay in the dark under the wool blankets he'd left her, without a word, and she listened to the wind, and she thought about a man standing alone in a yard while 3 riders threatened to take everything his family was buried under, and she thought about the fact that he had faced them without once raising his voice, and she thought about the way he'd said, "I like it very much," like the words had escaped from somewhere he kept locked up. She thought about her father sitting at that cold table telling her he'd carry what he'd done to her until the day he died. And she thought for the first time that maybe her father hadn't sold her to a monster after all. Maybe he'd done something far stranger and more frightening than that. She turned onto her side and stared at the door she hadn't locked, and she whispered into the dark so quietly that even she could barely hear it, "Kindness isn't love." But she didn't believe it anymore. Not the way she had 2 days ago. Not the way she'd needed to. And somewhere down the hall, a man who had taught himself for 11 years to need no one lay awake in the dark too, listening though he'd never admit it for the small, damning sound of a lock that never came. It never did. And both of them lay there in the dark on opposite sides of a house that was slowly, quietly, and against all their careful defenses, becoming a home each one, certain the other was asleep, and each one wide awake, listening to the storm and wondering what in God's name was happening to them. Orchestrated, dialogue-driven narrative with rapid pacing, layered twists and retention hooks. Orchestrated, dialogue-driven narrative with rapid pacing, layered twists and retention hooks. The study door was already open when Clara came down before dawn, and Nathaniel was inside, and she stopped in the doorway because she had never seen a man look so out of place in his own home. "You didn't sleep," she said. He looked up from the mountain of papers he'd pulled out onto the desk. His eyes were red-rimmed. "Neither did you from the sound of your step on the stairs. How long have you been at this?" "Since about 2. Couldn't lie there anymore." He rubbed a hand over his face. "Turns out you were right about the records. I've got every scrap of paper this ranch ever generated. I've also got no earthly idea what any of it means. My father kept it, and his father before him, and I just kept adding to the pile. It's a mess." Clara stepped into the room. She looked at the papers spread across the desk, the boxes stacked on the floor, the ledgers stuffed into shelves without any order at all. "Move," she said. Nathaniel blinked. "I'm sorry. Get up. You're in my chair." She set her hands on her hips. "You've been fighting this pile all night and losing because you don't know how to read it. I do. My father couldn't keep a farm alive, but he could keep books, and he taught me before the drought took everything. So get up, Mr. Brooks, and let someone in this house who knows what she's doing sit down." For a moment, he just stared at her. Then slowly the corner of his mouth moved, not a smile, he didn't seem to know how to do those, but the ghost of where one might live. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and he got up. By midday, she had order where there'd been chaos. She'd sorted the papers into stacks that made sense, deeds in one, tax receipts in another, surveys in a third, and Nathaniel had spent the morning fetching whatever she asked for and saying little, watching her work with an expression she was trying very hard not to notice. "Here," she said finally, and her voice had changed. "Look." He came around the desk and leaned over her shoulder. He was careful even then to keep a hand's width of space between them. "This is the original survey of the North Section," Clara said, "dated 1856, signed by the territorial surveyor. It's clean, Nathaniel. There's nothing flawed about it. Vance is lying. Then we take it to the court, and No," she held up a finger. "That's what I don't understand. If the survey is clean and Vance's lawyers looked into it like he said, then they'd know it's clean too. So either he's bluffing, or..." Clara went quiet. She looked down at the paper. "Or he already knows something we don't," she said slowly. "Because a man like that doesn't ride onto another man's land and make threats. He can't back up. Not with 2 hired guns behind him. He came here sure of himself, which means he thinks he's already holding the winning card." Nathaniel straightened. The easy quiet went out of him. What card, he said. I don't know yet. She met his eyes. But I intend to find out. It was Elias who gave them the first piece. He came into the kitchen that evening while Clara was cooking. She'd started doing that too, without quite deciding to, because a man couldn't fight for his land on nothing but cold biscuits, and he stood turning his hat in his hands like a man with something stuck in his throat. You knew Harlan Vance was coming, Clara said. It wasn't a guess. She'd seen it in the old man's face all day. Elias sighed. I heard talk in town. Didn't want to believe it. What talk? Vance has been buying up notes. Elias set his hat on the table. Old debts. Loans folks took out years ago and never quite paid off. He's been quietly buying them from the bank in Willow Creek. Nobody thought much of it. Man's rich men collect things. He looked at Nathaniel. But then I got to thinking, why would a man buying up half the county's debt come sniffing around your land when your land's paid free and clear? Nathaniel had gone very still. Say it plain, Elias. I don't think your land's as free and clear as you believe it is, son, Elias said quietly. I think there's a note out there somewhere with the Brooks name on it, and I think Harlan Vance already owns it. The kitchen went silent. Clara watched the color drain out of Nathaniel's face, and she understood all at once that the winning card she'd been trying to find had just been laid on the table. That's not possible, Nathaniel said. My father never borrowed $1 in his life. He'd have sooner starved. There's no note. There can't be. When did your father die? Clara asked. 11 years ago. Something flickered across his face when he said it. Same year He stopped. Same year you, what? Nothing. He turned away. There's no note. Elias, you're chasing shadows. But Clara had seen the flicker. She'd been reading faces her whole life the way her father read weather, and she knew the difference between a man who was sure and a man who was afraid he might be wrong. Nathaniel Brooks was afraid. She waited until Elias had gone. She waited until Nathaniel had eaten in silence and pushed his plate away half full. And then she said very gently, the way you'd approach a spooked horse, what happened 11 years ago? I told you, my mother passed, my father passed the same year. He wouldn't look at her. It was a bad year, that's all. That's not all. Clara leaned forward. You stopped yourself twice today. Once when you said the year your father died, once just now. There's something you're not telling me, and if I'm going to help you keep this land, I need to know what it is. You don't need to know anything. His voice went hard and she saw the door in him start to swing shut. This isn't your fight, Clara. You didn't ask for it. You've done more than enough sorting my papers. You don't owe me. Don't. She said it sharp enough to stop him. Don't do that. Don't push me out the second it gets real. You've spent 11 years standing alone in that yard, letting the whole valley think the worst of you, rather than let one soul stand at your back. Well, I'm standing here, and I'm not going anywhere. So you can either tell me the truth, or you can keep it locked up and lose your land the way you've lost everything else by carrying it alone. The words landed harder than she'd meant them to. She saw them land. For a long moment, Nathaniel Brooks said nothing at all. His jaw worked. His hands flat on the table, curled slowly into fists, and then slowly uncurled. And then he did the thing she would not have believed him capable of when she'd first walked into his cold house 9 days before. He told her the truth. My father was a proud man, he began, and his voice had gone low and rough. Prouder than he could afford to be. When the sickness came through the valley that winter, my mother caught it first. There was a doctor down in Cheyenne who trained back east, supposed to be the best in the territory. My father sent for him. It cost more than we had. Clara didn't move. She didn't breathe. The doctor came. He did everything he could. It wasn't enough she passed anyway in the spring. Nathaniel's throat worked. But the bill was real. $200. A fortune. And my father, proud as he was, couldn't stand the thought of the whole valley knowing Nathaniel Brooks Sr. couldn't pay his debts. So he went to the bank, quiet, and he borrowed against the north section the one piece of land he swore he'd never touch because his own father was buried in it. He closed his eyes. He signed a note for $200 secured against the north field, and he told no one, not even me. I only found out because I found the paper in his things after he died. Then you paid it, Clara said. You must have paid it. Nathaniel opened his eyes. I meant to, he said. God help me, I meant to. But that same year, everything came at once. My mother, then my father, 3 months behind her. The herd took the black leg, and I lost 40 head. There was a man. He stopped again. Something dark passed over his face. There was a foreman and I trusted. I was young and I was grieving, and I wasn't watching, and he robbed me blind and ran off before I caught it. By the time the dust settled, I was near broke and half out of my mind, and that note, he shook his head. That note was $200 I didn't have. So I went to the bank and I made an arrangement. Interest only, a little each year, and I've been paying it that way ever since, quietly, same as my father. Because I was too proud to let anyone know that the great Nathaniel Brooks, that folks are so scared of, has been carrying his dead father's debt for 11 years. Clara sat back. That's the card, she said softly. That's what Vance is holding. He bought the note from the bank. If Elias is right, Nathaniel's voice was barely above a whisper now. If Vance owns that note, then he owns a claim against the North Section. And if he can prove I've never paid the principal, which I haven't in 11 years, then he can call the whole thing due at once. $200 plus 11 years of interest. He laughed, and there was no humor in it at all. It'd be more than the land's worth. I couldn't pay it. And when I couldn't, he'd take the field. And once he had the field, with my family buried in it, he'd have leverage to squeeze me off the rest. How much? Clara asked. If you had to pay it all at once right now, how much? Nathaniel was quiet. Near $600, he said. I don't have $600, Clara. I've got cattle worth more than that on the hoof, but I can't sell them fast enough or high enough in the dead of winter to raise that kind of cash before he moves. He knows that. That's why he came now, in January, when I'm land rich and money poor, and there's nothing I can do about it. The kitchen was silent except for the fire, and Clara Whitmore, who had come to this house believing she was the one who needed saving, looked at the man across the table. This hard, quiet, lonely man who had spent 11 years too proud to ask a single soul for help, and felt something settle inside her chest that she couldn't name and didn't want to. Then we don't pay it his way, she said. Nathaniel looked up. You keep saying we. His voice caught on the word. You don't have to. This is mine to carry. It always has been. That's exactly the problem, Clara said. You've carried everything alone for so long, you've forgotten it can be done any other way. She stood up, gathered his half-empty plate, and looked down at him. You didn't force me to do a single thing since I walked through that door. Not one. So understand me, Nathaniel Brooks, this right here I'm choosing. Nobody's making me. I'm choosing to stand in this fight with you. And you don't get a say in it because for once in your life, someone is doing something for you and not the other way around. He stared at her like she'd struck him. Why? He said. It came out cracked. Why would you do that? After what your father did? After what I did buying you off him? I don't know why, Clara said honestly. I've been asking myself that same question every night. All I know is I walked into this house hating you, and somewhere in the last 9 days that stopped being true, and I don't understand it, and I'm too tired to keep fighting yet. She turned toward the kitchen. So don't ask me why. Just let me help you. For once, let someone help you. She didn't wait for his answer, but she heard him very quietly behind her say a word she didn't think he'd said out loud in a very long time. Please, he said, not asking her to stop, asking her to stay, and she did. They went to Willow Creek 2 days later, together, and it was the first time they'd ridden anywhere side by side. Clara noticed how the town looked at them. She noticed the whispers, the way conversations stopped. When their wagon rolled past, the way women pulled their children a little closer, as though the ruthless Nathaniel Brooks might snatch them up. She saw him notice it too, and she saw how he trained himself not to flinch, jaw set eyes forward, riding through the contempt of a whole town like a man riding through weather. It made her furious in a way she didn't expect. They don't know a thing about you, she said under her breath. No, Nathaniel agreed. And, they don't. Then why don't you tell them the workers you pay fair, the families you help? Elias told me. You've been quietly keeping half this valley alive for years, and you let them all think you're a monster. Why? Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Because the second you start helping people so they'll think well of you, he said, it stops being help and starts being a trade. My mother taught me that. You do right because it's right, not because you want anyone's good opinion. He flicked the reins. Their good opinion never kept a soul warm through a winter. But the wood I leave outside the Coleman place does. Clara stared at him. She thought about Bess Coleman, the foolish girl who'd told Toby that Nathaniel Brooks had wolf's eyes. She thought about how the Coleman family had made it through last winter when half the valley figured they wouldn't. And she thought about a stack of wood appearing outside a poor family's door, left in the dark by a man too proud to be thanked and too kind to stop. "You're a strange man, Nathaniel Brooks," she said, "so I've been told." "I don't think I meant it the way you're used to hearing it." He glanced at her, and for just a second the mask slipped, and she saw underneath it a man who was not sure he'd heard her right, who wanted very badly to have heard her right, and who didn't dare hope. "No," he said carefully, "I don't reckon you did." The bank in Willow Creek was run by a man named Pruitt, who was thin and nervous and would not meet Nathaniel's eyes. "The Brooks note," Nathaniel said, laying his hands flat on the counter. "The one my father took out against the north section. I want to see it. I want to pay it in full and be done with it." Pruitt swallowed. "Mr. Brooks, that's not the note's been sold," Clara said. She'd been watching his face. "You sold it. To Harlan Vance." Pruitt's silence was answer enough. "When?" Nathaniel said. 3 weeks ago." The banker's voice shook. "Mr. Brooks, you have to understand Vance came in and offered the full value plus a premium. In cash. I have shareholders. I have a responsibility to." "You had a responsibility to me." Nathaniel's voice didn't rise. It never rose. But something in it made Pruitt go pale. 11 years I've paid you, every year, never missed. And you sold my father's debt to the one man in this territory trying to take my land, and you didn't so much as send word. I couldn't, he made me sign a confidentiality agreement," Clara finished. She was putting it together fast now, faster than she liked. "He paid you extra to keep quiet, so that when he came for the land, Nathaniel wouldn't have time to raise the money." She leaned across the counter. "How long, Mr. Pruitt, how long does Nathaniel have before Vance can call the note due?" Pruitt looked like he might be sick. 30 days, he whispered. "From the date of sale. There's a clause. Vance can demand payment in full at the end of 30 days, and if it isn't paid..." "He takes the field," Clara said. 3 weeks ago, Nathaniel said slowly. "The note sold 3 weeks ago." The math landed on all three of them at once. 9 days, Clara breathed. "You have 9 days." The ride home was silent for a long time. Clara watched Nathaniel's hands on the reins, watched the knuckles go white and then loosen over and over, and she knew he was doing the same arithmetic she was and coming up empty every time. "There's no way to raise $600 in 9 days, he said finally. "Not in winter, not selling cattle. I'd have to move the whole herd to the railhead, and even then the price is rock bottom this time of year, and I'd lose the ranch to save the field. That's if a buyer'd even take them fast enough." He shook his head. "He's got me, Clara. Whatever else he is, Vance is smart. He built the trap, and he waited 11 years for me to walk all the way into the middle of it. Then we don't pay the note. You keep saying we don't pay it his way, but there is no other way. The note's real. My father signed it. I owe it." "You owe $200, Clara said. "You owe $200 that your father borrowed to try to save your dying mother. That's what the note is. That's all it is." Her voice was rising now, fierce. "The other 400 is 11 years of interest that Vance is trying to collect all at once, specifically to break you. That's not a debt, Nathaniel. That's a weapon. And weapons can be taken apart if you understand how they're built." Nathaniel looked at her. "You've got that look," he said. "The one you had over the survey. You've thought of something." "Maybe." Clara stared out at the frozen road. "The note was secured against the north section. But it was taken out by your father, not you, and your father is dead. So the debt passed to me. That's how it works." "Does it?" She turns to him. "When your father died, was there an estate? Did anyone administer it? Did a court ever formally pass his debts to you, or did you just..." She searched for the word. "Assume them quietly, the way you assume everything. Did you ever actually sign anything that made his note your note?" Nathaniel opened his mouth. Then he closed it. "No," he said slowly. "I never, when he died, I just kept paying it. I went to Pruitt and I said I'd keep up the payments, and he said fine. And I never signed a thing. I just paid." "So legally," Clara said, and her heart was starting to pound now. The note might still be your father's, an 11-year-old debt against a dead man's estate that was never properly transferred, that the original bank let sit without ever formalizing. She grabbed his arm without thinking. Nathaniel, if that note was never legally assigned to you, then Vance didn't buy a claim against your land. He bought a claim against a dead man's estate that was closed a decade ago. It might be worthless. Nathaniel stared at her. He shook his head. That's a thin thread, Clara. That's a lawyer's trick. Vance is winning with a lawyer's trick. We fight him with a better one. She hadn't let go of his arm. But I don't know the law well enough to be sure. We need someone who does. A real lawyer. An honest one, not one of Vance's. There isn't an honest lawyer in this county who'll cross Harlan Vance, Nathaniel said. He owns half of them and scares the other half. Then we find one who isn't in this county. Clara finally let go of his arm, and both of them were quiet for a second, aware of the fact that she'd been holding it. Cheyenne. There has to be someone in Cheyenne, somewhere far enough that Vance doesn't own them. Nathaniel didn't answer right away. You'd do that, he said. You'd ride 2 days to Cheyenne in January over what might be nothing but a thin thread for a piece of land that isn't yours, that belongs to a man you've known 9 days, who paid your father to marry you. Yes, Clara said. I would. Why? And this time she didn't say, I don't know. This time she looked at him, really looked at him, at the tired, careful eyes and the mouth that didn't know how to smile and the hands that left wood outside poor families' doors in the dark. And she said the thing that had been true for days before she was willing to admit it. Because I've stopped being able to picture a life where I let them take it from you, she said. That's why. Nathaniel Brooks looked at her for a long, long moment. And then he reached over slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, the way he did everything, and he covered her hand with his, just for a second, just once. All right, he said, and his voice wasn't quite steady. Cheyenne. But they never made it to Cheyenne, because Harlan Vance came back first. He was waiting for them when they rode into the yard at dusk, not on horseback this time, but in a fine covered carriage with his 2 hired men flanking it, and a third man Clara didn't recognize sitting beside him in a black coat with a leather case on his knees. A lawyer. She knew it before anyone said a word. Mr. Brooks, Vance called out, climbing down. Mrs. Brooks, I was hoping to catch you both. Save myself a second trip. Nathaniel stepped down from the wagon and put himself without any fuss about it between Vance and Clara. She noticed. She noticed everything about him now. You're on my land again, Vance. For now. Vance smiled his ugly smile. I've come to make you an offer, Brooks. A generous one. More generous than you deserve, but I'm a Christian man. He gestured to the lawyer. My associate here has drawn up the papers. I'll pay you a fair price for the whole spread house herd, all of it. You take the money, you take your pretty wife, and you go start fresh somewhere. The whole valley doesn't spit when you ride by. Clean break. Everybody wins. The answer's no. You haven't heard the number. I don't need to. Nathaniel didn't move. It's not for sale. Vance's smile didn't waver, but something cold came into his eyes. You misunderstand me, son. I'm not really asking. He nodded to the lawyer who opened the leather case and produced a document. This is the note your father signed against the north section. I own it now, and per its terms, I'm calling it due. $640. Payable in full. He checked a watch he didn't need to check. You've got till the end of the month. 6 days. When you can't pay, and we both know you can't, the North Field comes to me, and a man whose family plot belongs to his worst enemy tends to sell the rest real quick at whatever price that enemy feels like offering. He tucked the watch away. So we can do this the easy way, and you take my fair price now, or the hard way, and I take the field in 6 days and lowball you on the rest come spring. Your choice. Clara's heart was slamming. 6 days, not 9, they'd lost 3 days somehow, or Vance had moved the date, or Pruitt had been wrong, it didn't matter. 6 days. There was no way to reach Cheyenne and back in 6 days. No way to find a lawyer, no way to test the thin thread, no way to do anything but stand in this yard and watch it all come apart. She saw Nathaniel understand it too. She saw his shoulders start just slightly to sink. And something rose up in her that she didn't decide on. It just came. That note's not worth the paper it's printed on, Clara said, and she stepped out from behind her husband to stand beside him. Vance's eyebrows went up. The lawyer's head turned. I beg your pardon, Mrs. Brooks. You bought a claim against a dead man's estate that was closed 11 years ago, Clara said. Her voice didn't shake. She made sure it didn't shake. The note was signed by Nathaniel's father. It was never legally transferred to my husband. There was no administration of the estate, no formal assignment, nothing. You didn't buy a claim against this land, Mr. Vance. You bought a piece of paper signed by a corpse, and I'd wager your fancy lawyer there knew it when he let you pay for it. The yard went dead silent. Clara watched the lawyer's face. That was where the truth would show, not in Vance's and the lawyer's. And it did. Just for a flicker, just for half a second, she saw the man's eyes dart sideways at Vance, and she knew that she'd hit something real. But Vance recovered fast. She'd give him that. That's a clever little theory, he said, and his voice had gone soft and dangerous. Did you cook that up yourself, Mrs. Brooks, all on your own? He looked her up and down in a way that made Nathaniel go rigid beside her. Because it's a shame, a real shame, a woman that clever wasted on a broke rancher's dirt farm. He smiled. Tell you what, since you're so clever, let me tell you something you don't know. Vance, Nathaniel said low, a warning. No, let me. She'll want to hear it. Clever girl like her. Vance's eyes glittered. You want to know why I'm so sure that note transfers to your husband? You want to know how I know it'll hold up in any court in this territory? He leaned in. Because your husband signed it, not his father. Him, 11 years ago. Nathaniel Brooks signed a new note in his own hand, assuming his father's debt in full, and I've got it right here in this case with his signature on the bottom plain as day. Clara felt the ground tilt. She turned to Nathaniel, and the look on his face, the stricken, gray, cornered look on his face told her that Harlan Vance was telling the truth. Nathaniel, she said. He didn't answer. Nathaniel, her voice cracked. Did you sign a new note? He couldn't look at her. Show me, Clara said to the lawyer. Her whole body had gone cold. Not at all. Show me the signature. The lawyer glanced at Vance. Vance nodded, enjoying himself now. And the lawyer produced a second document and held it up. And there it was. A note dated 11 years ago. Nathaniel Brooks's signature at the bottom, clear and firm. Except Clara had spent the last 2 days buried in this man's papers. She had read 100 documents in his hand. She had sorted every ledger and deed and receipt this ranch had produced, and she had come to know the shape of Nathaniel Brooks's signature the way you come to know a face. And the signature on that note was wrong. It was close, it was very close, but the N was wrong. Nathaniel looped his the same way every single time, and this one didn't loop, and the pressure at the end of Brooks trailed off in a way his never did. Clara had been staring at the real thing for 2 days. And she was looking right now at a forgery. The cold left her all at once, and something hot came rushing in to take its place. That's not his signature, she said. Vance's smile flickered. I've spent 2 days reading every document my husband ever signed. Clara went on, and her voice was climbing, ringing out across the yard so that Elias and 2 of the hands who drifted over could hear every word. I know his hand better than I know my own, and that is not it. The N is wrong, the pressure's wrong. Someone copied it, someone good, someone who'd seen the real thing, but they got it wrong, and I can prove it because I've got a stack of the genuine article inside that house a foot high. She turned on the lawyer. You forged it, or you paid someone to. Nathaniel never signed a new note. His father's debt was never transferred. And when you couldn't make it transfer legally, you manufactured the paper that would do it for you. The lawyer had gone white. Vance's face had gone very still. And Nathaniel Brooks was staring at his wife like she had reached into the middle of the worst night of his life and pulled him out of it with her bare hands. You're bluffing, Vance said, but it didn't come out the way his threats had. It came out uncertain. Am I? Clara stepped forward. Take it to court then. Take your forged note to a real judge, an honest one in Cheyenne where you don't own anybody, and put it next to 11 years of genuine documents in Nathaniel Brooks's actual hand. Let's see whose signature holds up. Let's see what a forgery charge does to a man who owns half the county's debt when the whole territory finds out how he collects it. She was shaking now, but not with fear. You didn't buy a claim, Mr. Vance. You bought a crime, and you just confessed to it in a yard full of witnesses. The silence stretched out unbearable and thin, and then Harlan Vance did the thing that told Clara she'd won. He looked at his lawyer. Just a glance. Just a flick of the eyes, exactly the way the lawyer had looked at him a minute before. One frightened man checking with another. And in that single glance, every ounce of Vance's certainty drained away, because both of them knew that she was right, that the note was forged, that they'd counted on a broke, isolated, hated rancher, having no one at his side clever enough or brave enough to catch it. They'd counted on Nathaniel Brooks being alone. They hadn't counted on Clara. "This isn't finished," Vance said. His voice had lost all its silk. He was already backing toward the carriage. "You hear me, Brooks? A forged note," she says. "We'll see. We'll just see what—" "Get off my land," Nathaniel said, and he took one step forward. Just one. The same single step Clara had watched him take 9 days ago, the one that had scattered 3 men on horseback without a hand raised. Except this time she was standing beside him when he took it, and this time she understood exactly what it was. Not a threat of violence, but the absolute bottomless stillness of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything in the world to protect, and had just remembered for the first time in 11 years that he wasn't protecting it alone. Vance got into his carriage. The 2 hired men mounted up, and they left not slow and sneering, the way they'd come, but fast the way men leave a thing they have suddenly realized is more dangerous than they thought. Clara stood in the yard shaking until the sound of the carriage had died away completely. Then her legs went and Nathaniel caught her. He caught her the way he did everything, carefully giving her every chance to pull away. But she didn't pull away. She turned into him, and she pressed her face against his chest, and she felt his arms come around her, slow and disbelieving, like a man holding something he was sure would vanish. "You found it," he said into her hair. His voice was wrecked. 2 days. You spent 2 days buried in my papers, and you didn't even know why. And you found the one thing that could save me. How? How did you—" "I told you." Clara's voice was muffled against him. "I stopped being able to picture a life where I let them take it from you." She pulled back just enough to look up at his face. "Why didn't you tell me you never signed it when Vance said you had that look? You let me think." "Because for a second I wasn't sure," Nathaniel said. "It's been 11 years. I signed 100 papers that year, half out of my mind with grief. When he said it, I couldn't swear I hadn't. I couldn't remember." His hands tightened on her arms. "But you could. You were sure when I wasn't. You knew my own hand better than I knew it myself." He shook his head slowly, like a man surfacing from deep water. "Nobody's ever known me that well, Clara. Nobody's ever bothered to try." And Clara Whitmore, who had thrown a wedding dress against a wall 11 days ago and sworn she'd never loved the man she was being sold to, stood in the cold yard of Brooks Ranch in the circle of that man's arms and understood that somewhere in the last 11 days, the thing she'd sworn would never happen had already happened quietly without her permission, the same way everything about Nathaniel Brooks happened. She didn't say it. She wasn't ready to say it. But she didn't pull away either. And when Nathaniel Brooks, who did not know how to smile, finally smiled small and broken and astonished right there in the fading light, with his ranch still his and his enemy, in flight and his wife in his arms, Clara felt it go through her like the first warm day after the longest winter of her life. "It's not over," she said quietly. "He'll be back. Men like that don't lose gracefully. He confessed to a forgery in front of witnesses that makes him more dangerous now, not less. He can't afford to let us walk into a courtroom." "I know," Nathaniel said. "We have to get to Cheyenne. We have to file it, make it real before he can bury the evidence or buy the judge or worse." "I know." "Then why," Clara said, "are you smiling at me like that?" Nathaniel Brooks looked down at the woman who had walked into his cold, dead house 11 days ago, hating him, and had somehow, against everything either of them had braced for, become the first person in 11 years to stand between him and the whole hard world. "Because for the first time since I was a boy," he said, "I'm not facing it alone." And he tightened his arms around her, and she let him, and neither of them let go. Not for a long time, not while the last of the light went out of the sky, not while the cold came down hard around the two of them standing together in the middle of everything they were about to fight to keep. They left for Cheyenne before dawn the next morning, and they never made it past the second day. The storm came down out of the north with no warning at all. The kind of storm that killed men on the open range every winter that Elias had spent 40 years learning to smell. Before it hit, except this one came too fast even for him. 1 hour the sky was gray and still. The next it was white and screaming, and there was no road, no horizon, no anything but the wind trying to peel them off the earth. "We have to turn back!" Clara shouted over it. She was clinging to the wagon bench with both hands. Nathaniel, nobody can make Cheyenne through this. We can't turn her back either, he shouted. We're too far from the ranch and too far from town both. We make for the old line shack. It's close. It's the only thing close. He hauled the team around and Clara held on, and the world came apart into wind and cold and white, and somewhere in the middle of it, she understood that the fight over the land, the note Vance, all of it had just stopped mattering, because now the only thing that mattered was living through the next hour. The line shack was one room half buried in a drift by the time they reached it, and Nathaniel got the horses into the lean-to and got Clara inside and got a fire going in the little stove with hands that had gone clumsy from the cold. And then the two of them sat in the dark with the storm trying to tear the roof off, and there was nothing to do but wait and be alive and be alone together in a way they had never been. How long? Clara asked. Her teeth were chattering. How long do these last? Day, sometimes two. Nathaniel pulled the one blanket off the cot and put it around her shoulders. We've got wood. We've got the horses. We'll be all right. He said it steady, but she'd learned to read him now, and she heard what he wasn't saying. We've lost the Cheyenne trip, she said, even if it breaks tomorrow. We can't reach a lawyer and get back and file anything before Vance's 6 days are up. Nathaniel was quiet. Yeah, he said finally. We have. So we're going to lose the field. Maybe. He sat down beside her, close but not touching the careful space he always left. Maybe not. There's still the forgery. He can't take the field clean if we can prove the note's forged. Even Vance can't outrun that if enough people know. He stared into the little fire, but he'll take it dirty in the meantime. He'll move on it the second the 6 days are up, and he'll worry about the courtroom later. Possession's 9 points of the law out here. Once he's got my family's graves, getting them back is a different fight. Clara pulled the blanket tighter. Then it wasn't supposed to be about a lawyer at all, she said slowly. Was it? This trip? You knew we probably couldn't make it in time. Nathaniel didn't answer right away. I hoped we could, he said. But no, not really. Then why are we out here, Nathaniel? Why are we freezing to death in a line shack if you knew it wouldn't work? He looked at her, and the firelight moved across that hard, tired face, and for once he didn't fold anything away. Because I wanted 6 more days with you before it all came down, he said. Because I figured whether we won or lost, at least on the road to Cheyenne, it'd be the two of us and nobody in this valley whispering, and I could pretend for a little while that... He stopped. His jaw worked. It was selfish. I dragged you into a storm over it. I'm sorry. Clara stared at him. Pretend what? She said quietly. Don't. Pretend what, Nathaniel? He closed his eyes. That you'd have chosen it, he said. The marriage. That you'd have chosen me. Not because your father owed money. Not because you had nowhere else to go. Just chosen it. Chosen me. He opened his eyes, and there was something in them so raw and undefended that it took her breath. I know it's not real, Clara. I know what I am, and I know how you came to be here. But God help me, these 11 days having you in that house, it's the first time in my whole life I've wanted something I had no right to want. And I couldn't stop wanting it. So I made up a reason to spend 6 more days by your side before I lost the land, and you went home in the spring like the bargain said. He looked away. That's why we're in this shack. Because I'm a fool. Because I let myself want you. The wind screamed against the walls. And Clara Whitmore, wrapped in a blanket in a freezing one-room shack in the middle of a killing storm, felt every wall she'd built in 11 days come down at once. You didn't make it up, she said. Nathaniel went still. I would have chosen it, Clara said. Her voice shook, but not from the cold now. That's the thing I couldn't figure out. Why I kept saying we. Why I couldn't picture leaving in the spring. Why I stopped locking my door the first night and never started again. She reached out, this time, for once, she was the one to close the space he always left, and she put her hand over his. I would have chosen you, Nathaniel. If my father had never owed a dime, if I'd met you at a church social, like an ordinary girl, I'd have chosen you. I don't need 6 days of pretending. I've already chosen it. I chose it somewhere back in that house, and I was just too scared to say it out loud. Nathaniel Brooks looked at her like a man who had spent his whole life in winter and did not trust the first day of spring. You don't have to say that, he said. Not because we're going to lose the land, not out of pity. I'd rather have the truth than... This is the truth. She took his face in both her cold hands and made him look at her. You spent 11 years believing you weren't allowed to need anyone. Well, I need you, you stubborn, quiet, impossible man. I need you, and I want you, and I'm choosing you, and I don't care about the note, or the field, or Harlan Vance, or the whole valley, and every foolish thing they've ever said about you. I know who you are. I've watched you for 11 days. I know exactly who you are. Her voice broke. And I love you. There. I said it out loud. Now, you can't pretend I didn't. For a long moment, Nathaniel didn't move at all. And then he made a sound she'd never heard from him. Half a laugh and half something that had been locked up for 11 years finally coming loose. And he pulled her into him, and he held her like she was the only warm thing left in the whole white screaming world. And Clara felt his shoulders shake, and she realized that the great and terrible Nathaniel Brooks, that a whole valley crossed the street to avoid, was crying into her hair. I love you, he said, rough and disbelieving. God, Clara, I love you. I've loved you since you threw my own kindness back in my face at that supper table and told me I couldn't bribe you into eating. I loved you, and I thought I'd have to spend the rest of my life keeping it locked up, watching you leave in the spring, and You are not going to have to keep anything locked up ever again, Clara said. Not from me. And she kissed him. She kissed him in this firelight, with the storm coming apart against the walls, and it was nothing like the things she'd feared 11 days ago when she'd braced herself for a man who would take what he wanted. It was the opposite of that. It was two people who had each spent their whole lives certain they'd have to face the world alone, discovering at the exact same moment that they were wrong. The storm blew itself out sometime in the night. They didn't sleep. They sat up in front of the little stove and talked the way neither of them had ever talked to another living soul. And Clara learned about a boy who'd buried both his parents in 1 year, and Nathaniel learned about a girl who'd pulled a plow herself when the mule went lame and never once let her father see her cry. And somewhere in the small hours, warm against each other, with the fire burning low, Clara felt something she had not felt since before the drought took her family's farm. She felt like she was home, but the morning brought the reckoning back. They rode into the ranch yard a little before noon, half frozen and exhausted, and Elias came running out to meet them before the wagon had even stopped, and Clara knew from his face that something had happened. Thank God, the old man said. Thank God I thought the storm I sent 2 men out looking, He caught his breath. Nathaniel, it's bad while you were gone. Vance moved. Nathaniel came down off the wagon fast. Moved how? The 6 days aren't up. He's not waiting on the 6 days. Elias's weathered face was gray. He came yesterday with the sheriff and a court paper. Says the note's in default already on account of you fleeing the county to avoid payment. Says you ran. He's got men on the north field right now, Nathaniel. He's fencing it. He's fencing off your family's graves. Clara felt Nathaniel go rigid beside her. He can't do that, she said. There's no default. We didn't flee. We went to file against his forgery. The 6 days aren't even up. He's got a judge's signature saying different, Elias said. Judge Coleman out of Willow Creek signed it yesterday afternoon. Coleman. Clara's mind was racing. Any relation to the Coleman family Nathaniel keeps in firewood every winter. Elias's mouth twisted. The judge's brother. Vance got to him, or bought him. Either way, it's signed, and it's legal enough that the sheriff went along with it, and there are men on that field right now with fence posts. For a moment, nobody said anything, and Clara watched something happen in Nathaniel Brooks that she had never seen before and hoped she'd never see again. She watched the careful, contained man she'd come to know simply go away. Something colder and older took his place. His hands opened and closed, his jaw set like iron. Nathaniel, she said. Nathaniel, look at me. He was already moving toward the barn, toward she realized with a jolt of pure fear the rifle. Nathaniel, she got in front of him. She put both hands flat on his chest. Stop. Stop and look at me. They're fencing my mother's grave, Clara. I know. My father cleared that ground with his own hands. They're both in it. And Harlan Vance has men putting up posts around it like it's a cattle pen. His voice was terrible and quiet. I've spent 11 years letting this valley say what it wants about me. I've let them call me a killer, and I never once gave them a reason. But if I have to give them a reason to keep my parents' graves out of that man's hands, then you become exactly what he needs you to be, Clara said. Nathaniel stopped. That's the trap, she said, fast urgent, both hands still pressed to his chest, feeling his heart slam under them. Don't you see it? He wants this. He wants you to ride out there with a rifle, a hated man everybody already fears gunning down men on a field the court says is legally his. That's not a land dispute anymore. Nathaniel, that's murder. That's a hanging. He doesn't have to win the forgery case if you're swinging from a rope. He wants you to go for that rifle. It's the whole reason he moved while we were gone. He was betting you'd come home and lose your head. Her voice cracked. Don't give it to him. Please. Please don't give him the one thing he can't get any other way. For a long, awful moment, Nathaniel Brooks stood absolutely still with his wife's hands on his chest and murder in his eyes. And then slowly the iron went out of his jaw. His hands unclenched, and he sagged forward just slightly and pressed his forehead down against the top of her head and breathed like a man who just pulled himself back from the edge of a cliff by his fingernails. How do you do that? He said, wrecked. How do you keep seeing it clear when I can't see anything at all? Because I'm not the one whose parents are in that ground. Clara wrapped her arms around him. Somebody has to keep their head, and it can't be you, not about this, so it has to be me. That's what I'm for now. That's what we are now. When you can't see, I see for you, and when I can't, you'll see for me. She pulled back and looked up at him. That's the whole thing, Nathaniel. That's what nobody ever let you have, somebody to see for you. He looked down at her, and the coldness was gone. The man she loved was back. All right, he said hoarsely. All right, not the rifle, then what? Tell me there's a then what, Clara, because I've got nothing. Clara let go of him. She stepped back. She wiped her face and stood up straight, and Nathaniel watched the fear turn into something else, watched his frightened wife turn into the woman who had faced down Harlan Vance in the yard with nothing but a forged signature in her own two eyes. There's a then what, she said, but you're not going to like it, and it's going to be the hardest thing you've ever done. Say it. We don't fight him with a rifle, Clara said. We fight him with the truth in front of so many people that no judge in his brother's pocket can bury it. And to do that, she took a breath, you're going to have to do the one thing you swore you'd never do. You're going to have to stand up in front of the whole valley that hates you, every soul who ever called you a monster, and you're going to have to let them see who you really are. Nathaniel stared at her. They won't listen to me, listen to me, he said. They've spent 11 years deciding what I am. You don't undo that with a speech. You're right, Clara said. They won't listen to you. She lifted her chin. So they're going to listen to me, and to Elias, and to every family in this valley you have kept warm and fed and alive for 11 years while letting them think you were a devil for doing it. You've spent all this time refusing to be thanked, Nathaniel. Well, the bills come due. It's time to let them thank you. In public. Loud enough that Harlan Vance can't drown it out. It took Clara 2 days to build it, and every one of those days, Vance's men were on the north field. And every one of those days, Nathaniel walked out to the edge of his own property and stood looking at the fence posts going up around his parents' graves and said nothing, and came back inside with his hands shaking from the effort of not going for the rifle. And every night Clara held him and reminded him of the trap, and every night he let her and Clara understood that she was watching a man remake himself in real time, learning at 35 after a lifetime alone how to let someone else carry a thing with him. She went from house to house. She started with the Colemans, not the judge, but the family in the little place at the edge of the valley, the ones with the firewood. She sat at their pipe, and she told them plainly what was happening, and she watched the mother's face change, and she watched the father. A proud man, not unlike her own, struggle with something for a long moment before he said quietly that he'd wondered for years where that wood came from, that they'd never have made it through 3 winters without it, that he'd always been too ashamed to ask. He didn't want you to know, Clara said. He never wanted anyone to know. But he needs you now. The man who kept your children warm needs this valley to stand up and say what he really is. Will you come? The Coleman father looked at his wife. His wife looked at their children. We'll come, he said. And then it was the next house, and the next. She found the family whose barn had burned 2 winters back, who'd woken the next morning to find lumber stacked in the yard and no note. She found the wedding whose husband's funeral had been quietly paid for by someone who never came forward. She found the man who'd made a mistake with money years ago and been given a job at Brooks Ranch when no one else in the county would hire him, and who'd never once been reminded of what he'd done. One by one, Clara Whitmore pulled the truth out of a valley that had been carrying it in scattered pieces without ever putting it together. And one by one, she watched people realize that the monster they'd feared had been the hand keeping half of them alive. By the second night she had them. She had all of them. And when she came home and told Nathaniel how many were coming, he sat down slowly at the kitchen table and put his face in his hands, and Clara realized he wasn't upset. He was overwhelmed. 11 years, he said into his hands. 11 years I told myself it didn't matter what they thought, that I didn't need a single one of them. He looked up and his eyes were wet. And now you tell me half the valley's about to stand up for me. And Clara, I don't know how to be a man people stand up for. I only ever learned how to be alone. Then it's a good thing, Clara said softly, that you're not going to be alone ever again. Harlan Vance came to serve the final papers on the morning the 6 days ended. He came with the sheriff, and he came with his lawyer, and he came with the smug certainty of a man about to close a trap he'd spent 11 years in a small fortune building. He rode into the yard expecting to find a broke-hated, isolated rancher with nothing at his back but one clever wife. He did not find that. He found the yard full. He found the Coleman family and the widow and the man he'd once mocked as a broke rancher's charity case, and 30 more besides families from all across the valley, standing in the cold in front of Brooks Ranch, standing between Harlan Vance and the man he'd come to break. He found Elias at the front of them with his gray mustache and his 40 years of knowing when a storm was coming. And he found Clara Whitmore standing on the porch beside her husband with a leather case of her own in her hands full of 11 years of genuine documents in Nathaniel Brooks's actual hand. Vance reined up hard. His smug certainty flickered. "What is this?" he said. "This," Clara said, and her voice carried clear across the silent yard, "is the valley you thought would look the other way." She came down the porch steps. "You counted on him being alone, Mr. Vance. You built your whole plan on 11 years of him letting people think the worst of him. But you made one mistake. You thought a man that proud must be a man with nobody. And you were wrong. He's got everybody. He just never let them know it until now." Vance's eyes swept the crowd. Clara watched him do the arithmetic, watched him count the faces, watched him recognize the sheriff shifting uncomfortably in his saddle. At the sight of so many witnesses, watched the whole careful trap start to come apart in his hands. "The note's in default," Vance said, but the silk was gone from his voice. "I've got a court order. This land is—" "The note's forged," Clara said, "and I can prove it, and now I've got 40 witnesses who'll swear they heard you called on it. And there's a judge in Cheyenne, an honest one, Mr. Vance, one you don't own, who's going to be very interested to hear how a note ended up in default on a day its own 6-day term hadn't even expired, signed off by the brother of the man who forged it." She held up the leather case. "You can take the field today. Maybe. With a bought judge and a nervous sheriff, maybe you can put your fence up around a dead man's grave. But you'll spend the rest of your life in a courtroom in front of the whole territory defending a forgery, and every single person standing in this yard will be a witness against you. So I'll ask you the same thing my husband asked you 11 days ago." Her voice dropped cold and clear. "Is it worth it?" The yard held its breath. And Harlan Vance, rich, powerful, patient, Harlan Vance, who had spent 11 years in a fortune building his trap, looked at the 40 faces arrayed against him, and looked at the sheriff, who would not meet his eye, and looked at the woman on the porch steps holding a case full of the truth, and made the only calculation a man like him ever really makes. He decided it wasn't worth it. "This isn't over," he said. It was what he always said. But it came out small this time, and everyone in the yard heard how small it was. "It is, though," Elias said mildly from the front of the crowd. "You just don't want to admit it yet." And Harlan Vance turned his fine carriage around, and he left Brooks Ranch for the last time. And 40 people stood in the cold and watched him go, and nobody cheered because it wasn't that kind of moment. It was quieter and deeper than cheering. It was a whole valley finally seeing a man clearly all at once after 11 years of getting him wrong. Nathaniel came down off the porch slow. He walked out into the middle of the yard, into the middle of all those faces, and Clara watched him stand there, not knowing what to do. This man who'd never in his life been the center of anything but fear. It was the Coleman father who broke it. He stepped forward and he stuck out his hand and he said rough and simple, "The wood, 3 winters. I never said thank you. I'm saying it now." Nathaniel took his hand. He couldn't speak. Clara could see he couldn't speak, so the man said it for him. "Thank you, Nathaniel." And then the widow stepped forward, and then the man he'd hired when no one else would. And one by one, the whole valley that had spent 11 years crossing the street to avoid him came up and took his hand and said the thing none of them had ever been allowed to say. And Nathaniel Brooks stood in the middle of it and shook every hand and could not get a single word out and didn't need to because his face said everything. Clara stood on the porch and watched her husband learn at 35 that he had never been as alone as he'd made himself believe. And when it was over, when the last hand had been shaken and the crowd had begun to drift back to their own lives, Nathaniel crossed the empty yard to where she stood, and he stopped in front of her, and for a long moment he just looked at her like she was something he'd been waiting for his whole life without knowing it. "You gave me my whole valley back," he said, "in 2 days. Something I threw away over 11 years, and you handed it back to me in 2 days." "I didn't give you anything," Clara said. "It was always yours. You earned every bit of it. I just made them say it out loud." She reached up and touched his face. "You did the hard part, Nathaniel. You let them see you. After 11 years of hiding, you stood in that yard and you let them see you. That's the bravest thing I've ever watched a person do." Nathaniel covered her hand with his. "There's still Cheyenne," he said, "the forgery, making it real in a real court so he can never come at us again. It's not finished." "No," Clara agreed, "it's not finished." But for the first time, she said, echoing the words he'd said to her in the yard 11 days ago in the dark, at the beginning of everything, "You're not facing it alone." And Nathaniel Brooks, who had walked into this story, a man who did not know how to smile, pulled his wife into his arms in the middle of the yard where his whole valley had just taken his hand, and he held her, and over her shoulder he looked out at the north field where his parents were buried in ground that was still and would remain his own. The fence posts were still standing out there. But tomorrow he would take them down himself, with his own hands, the way his father had cleared that ground with his. And this time he would not be doing it alone. They took the fence posts down together the next morning, the 2 of them, and it was Clara who pulled the last one free, while Nathaniel steadied the ground. And when it came loose, they stood over his parents' graves in silence for a long time. "I never come out here," Nathaniel said finally, "in 11 years. I couldn't. Why? Because I failed them." He crouched down and set his hand flat on the frozen earth. "My mother died because I couldn't get her a better doctor. My father died 3 months later of a broken heart because I couldn't fix that either. And then I near lost the land they left me because I was too proud to tell a living soul I was drowning." His voice was rough. "I couldn't stand out here and look at them knowing all that. And now," Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Then he stood and he looked at her, and something in his face had settled that had never been settled before. "Now I can tell them I finally got it right," he said, "that I stopped drowning, that somebody threw me a rope and I was smart enough to grab it." He took her hand. "I'd like them to know about you, Clara, if that doesn't sound too foolish, talking to graves. It doesn't sound foolish at all." So he did. He stood over his mother's grave and his father's in the cold, and he told them about the girl who'd thrown a wedding dress against a wall rather than be sold, who'd come to his house hating him and stayed to save everything he had. And Clara stood beside him and held his hand and did not cry, and then cried anyway and let him see it, because she'd learned in 11 days that letting Nathaniel Brooks see her cry was its own kind of gift, the same gift he gave her every time he let her see the man behind the wall. It should have been the end of it. It wasn't. The letter came 4 days later, carried out from Willow Creek by a boy on a lathered horse, and Elias brought it in with a look on his face that made Clara's stomach drop before she'd read a word. It was from Cheyenne. It was from the honest judge, the one they'd never reached, the one they'd been storming toward when the blizzard turned them back. Except he'd heard about them first. Word of a forged note and a bought judge and a hated rancher and the wife who'd faced down Harlan Vance in a full yard had traveled faster than any wagon could, the way the best stories always do, and it had reached a man in Cheyenne named Judge Harmon, who did not like what he'd heard about how justice was being done in Willow Creek. Nathaniel read it twice. Then he handed it to Clara without a word, and his face had gone unreadable in the way she'd learned meant he was protecting himself from hope. Clara read it, and her hands started to shake. "He's opening an inquiry," she said, "not just into the note, into all of it, into Vance, into Judge Coleman for signing a default order on a day the term hadn't expired." She looked up. "Nathaniel, he's not just going to clear the forgery, he's going after Vance. For everything. The bought judges, the confidentiality clauses, the notes he's been buying up across the whole county to squeeze people off their land." Her voice climbed. "He wants us to come to Cheyenne and testify, both of us. He wants sworn statements. He says," she found the line and read it out, "he says the pattern only becomes visible when someone finally stands up who isn't afraid of the man." For a moment, neither of them said anything. "That's us," Nathaniel said slowly. "We're the someone who finally stood up." "We're the someone who finally stood up," Clara agreed. And then the weight of it landed, and they looked at each other, and the same thought crossed both their faces at the same time. "Vance will know," Clara said. "The second we go to Cheyenne to testify, he'll know we're not just defending ourselves anymore. We're going after him, everything he's built." "A man like that," Nathaniel said, "doesn't have anything left to lose once you've decided to take it all." He looked out the window toward the road. He was dangerous when he thought he could win quiet and clean. He's going to be something else entirely now. Clara set the letter down on the table. "Then we'd better get to Cheyenne," she said, "before he can stop us from getting there at all." Then, they didn't get the chance to leave clean. Vance came the night before they meant to ride out, and this time he didn't come with a lawyer and a court paper and the pretense of the law. He came in the dark with his 2 hired men and 2 more Clara didn't recognize, and the first anyone knew of it was Elias pounding on the door shouting that there was fire in the hay barn. Nathaniel was out the door before Clara had her boots on. By the time she got outside, the hay barn was going up, and the men were fighting it with buckets and blankets, and through the smoke and the shouting, Clara saw the thing that made her blood stop cold. She saw 2 riders peel away from the chaos and make for the main house. For the house, where the leather case was, where 11 years of genuine documents in Nathaniel Brooks's own hand sat waiting to prove the forgery. The one thing that could sink Vance in Cheyenne. The evidence. "The papers," Clara screamed. "Nathaniel, they're not here for the barn. They're here for the papers." Nathaniel turned, and in the firelight, Clara watched him understand the whole thing at once. The fire was the distraction, the barn was bait, and Vance had never cared about the hay. He'd cared about getting every able hand out of the house and running toward the flames so that 2 men could slip inside and take the only evidence that could destroy him and burn it and leave Nathaniel Brooks with nothing but a wife's word against a rich man's lawyers in a Cheyenne courtroom. It was a good trap. It was very nearly a perfect one. Except for one thing Harlan Vance could not have known. Because Clara Whitmore had not left the leather case in the study. She'd moved it 3 days before without telling anyone on nothing but an instinct. She couldn't have explained the same instinct that had kept her family alive through the drought when smarter, richer families went under. Something about the way Vance had said this isn't over had lodged in her like a splinter, and one night she'd gone quietly into the study and taken the genuine documents out of the case and hidden them somewhere no one would think to look, and filled the case back up with old blank receipts so it would still have weight if anyone picked it up. She hadn't even told Nathaniel. She'd meant to. It had felt foolish, and she hadn't wanted him to think she didn't trust the locks on his house. Now she watched 2 of Harlan Vance's men break into that house, and she felt something that was almost like laughter, sharp and half hysterical, come up her throat. "Let them," she said. Nathaniel had started toward the house. She caught his arm. "Let them take it," she said. "Nathaniel, listen to me. Let them take the case. It's not the real one. I moved the papers 3 days ago. The case is full of blank paper. Let them steal it and burn it and let Vance think he's won, because the second he thinks he's safe, he'll stop being careful and will walk into Cheyenne with the real evidence he thinks doesn't exist anymore." Nathaniel stared at her. The barn burned behind him. His men shouted, and in the middle of it, he started impossibly to laugh. The real thing, the thing he'd only just learned how to do, because his wife had outthought Harlan Vance 3 days before Vance had even set his trap. "You moved the papers," he said, "on a hunch, 3 days ago. I get feelings sometimes." Clara couldn't help the fierce little smile. "My mother had them. She said the drought was coming a year before it did, and nobody listened. I listened to mine. The two men came out of the house. One of them had the leather case under his arm. They mounted up fast, and they rode past the burning barn to where Harlan Vance sat his horse at the edge of the firelight, watching, and Clara saw the man hand up the case, and she saw Vance take it, and she saw, even at that distance, even through the smoke, the ugly satisfaction settle over his face. He thought he'd won. He turned his horse, and as he did, he called out across the yard over the roar of the fire to the man he was sure he'd just ruined. Go on to Cheyenne Brooks. There was triumph in it and mockery. Go tell your judge about a forgery you can't prove. It'll be your word and your wife's against mine, and everyone knows what a jury thinks of a woman's word and a hated man's. He laughed. You should have taken my price. Now you'll get nothing at all. And he rode off into the dark carrying a leather case full of blank papers, certain he'd just burned the only thing that could touch him. Nathaniel put out the barn fire before dawn. They lost the hay and half the structure, but no animals and no men, and by the time the sun came up, the danger had passed and the truth of what had happened had settled over everyone. He'll go quiet now, Elias said, wiping soot from his face. He thinks it's done. He thinks he's beat you. Good, Clara said. She was already thinking 3 steps ahead. Let him. A careless Vance is exactly what we need. He'll walk into that Cheyenne courtroom, sure there's no evidence, and he won't have his lawyers ready for it. And when we lay 11 years of genuine documents on the table beside his forgery, she stopped. Her face changed. Nathaniel, he just gave us the last piece. What piece? He confessed again. She turned to Elias. How many men heard him just now? Shouting across the yard about a forgery Nathaniel can't prove. How many of your men heard that? Elias's weathered face slowly cracked into something like a grin. Every one of them, clear as a church bell. He admitted the note was forged, Clara said, out loud in front of witnesses. Again, the man cannot stop confessing to his own crime, first in the yard 11 days ago, now this. Because in his head, a forgery you can't prove is the same as no forgery at all. He keeps saying it because he thinks it's safe to say. She pressed her hands to her mouth. He doesn't understand that every time he says it out loud, he's building our case for us. They rode for Cheyenne 2 days later, and this time there was no storm. The trip took 3 days, and Clara spent most of it going over what she'd say, and most of what was left watching her husband, because something had changed in Nathaniel Brooks over these last weeks, something she could see settling into him more permanently with each mile they put between themselves and the ranch. He sat straighter. He met the eyes of strangers on the road. Twice in towns they passed through people who'd heard the story, because the story was traveling now ahead of them all across the territory, came up to shake his hand, and he let them, and he even once spoke first. You're different, Clara said the second night in the room they took at a way station. Am I? You know you are. She sat down beside him. A month ago, you rode through Willow Creek letting a whole town hate you without so much as lifting your chin. Yesterday, you said good morning to a stranger before he could say it to you. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. I spent 11 years, he said slowly, believing that the safest thing a man could do was need nobody and let nobody in. That every person you let close was just another person who could hurt you or leave you or die on you the way my parents did. He looked at her. And then you came and you got in. Anyway, I never even opened the door. You just came in through the wall. And the thing I'd spent 11 years being terrified of turned out to be the thing that saved me. He took her hand. It's hard to keep being afraid of a thing after it's already saved your life, so I stopped. And it turns out when you stop being afraid of people, some of them turn out to be worth knowing. Clara leaned her head on his shoulder. Judge Harmon's going to ask you to speak, she said, in front of the court, in front of Vance and his lawyers and whoever comes to watch, and people will come, Nathaniel, this story's too good not to draw a crowd. She felt him tense just slightly. You've never spoken in front of people in your life, and you're going to have to stand up and tell them all who you are and what he did. Can you do it? Nathaniel was silent for a long moment. A month ago, I couldn't have, he said. A month ago, I'd have handed you the papers and let you do all the talking and stood in the back where nobody could look at me. He turned his head and pressed his lips to the top of hers. But you told me something in a burning yard. You said somebody had to keep their head, and it couldn't be me, so it had to be you. When you can't see, I see for you. When I can't, you see for me. He drew a breath. Well, in that courtroom, you're going to need me to stand up, not hide in the back. Stand up in front of everyone and be seen. You've done the seeing for me long enough. It's my turn to see for you. So yeah, Clara, I can do it because you need me to. And that's a better reason than any I've ever had. Clara closed her eyes and she held on to him, and she thought that she had come to this marriage certain her life was over, and she had never once in her whole life before felt as alive as she did right now on the road to Cheyenne, beside a man who had learned how to stand up. The courtroom was full. The story had done exactly what Clara said it would. It had drawn a crowd from all over the territory, packed shoulder to shoulder, to see the rich man who bought up debts, and the hated rancher who'd finally stood up to him, and the clever wife who'd caught a forgery with her own two eyes. Vance was there at his table with 3 lawyers now instead of 1, and he was smiling because he still believed the evidence had burned in a leather case in his own hands. And Clara let him smile because there is no advantage in this world quite like an enemy who thinks he's already won. Judge Harmon was an old man with white hair and eyes that missed nothing, and when he called the room to order, the silence was immediate and total. Vance's lead lawyer spoke first, and he was good, smooth, and confident, painting Nathaniel as a violent, isolated debtor trying to escape a legitimate note through wild accusations of forgery he could not begin to substantiate. He noted with great regret that the defense had claimed to possess documents proving the forgery, and yet he spread his hands. No such documents had been produced, because he suggested delicately they had never existed at all. Clara watched Vance's smile widen. Then it was their turn, and Clara Whitmore stood up. She told the whole story plain and clear, the way she'd told it in the Coleman family's kitchen. The debt Nathaniel's father took to save his dying wife, the note Nathaniel never legally assumed, the forgery Vance manufactured when the law wouldn't give him what he wanted. She told about the confidentiality clause that Prewitt, the banker, had signed. She told about Judge Coleman's brother and the default order signed on a day the term hadn't expired. And then she told about the fire and the 2 men who broke into the house and the leather case they stole and carried triumphantly to Harlan Vance in the dark. He believes he burned our evidence, Clara said, and her voice rang out across the packed courtroom. He believes that case held the only proof of his forgery. He's been smiling all morning because of it. She turned and looked directly at Vance, and she watched the first flicker of unease cross his face. But that case was full of blank paper, Your Honor. I moved the real documents 3 days before the fire, on a feeling, because I've learned that a man like Harlan Vance says this isn't over and means it. The courtroom erupted. Vance was on his feet. His lawyers were on their feet. And Clara Whitmore reached into the bag at her side and drew out the real leather case and set it on the table in front of Judge Harmon with a sound that cut through the whole roaring room. 11 years of genuine document, she said. In my husband's actual hand. Deeds, receipts, letters, enough of the real thing to prove beyond any doubt that the signature on that note is a forgery. Compare them, Your Honor. That's all I ask. Put the note beside the truth and let anyone with eyes see the difference. Judge Harmon opened the case. He was an old man and careful, and he took his time, and the courtroom held its breath while he laid the forged note beside a dozen genuine signatures and bent over them with a glass. And the silence stretched out so tight Clara thought it might snap. Then Judge Harmon looked up. He looked at Harlan Vance for a long, long moment. The signatures, he said quietly, are not the same hand. The courtroom exploded again, and this time it did not settle, and through the roar of it, Clara found Nathaniel's eyes across the room, and she saw in them everything she felt in her own chest, not triumph, not yet, but the first crack of daylight after the longest night either of them had ever lived through. But it wasn't finished, because Vance still had 3 lawyers and money and 100 ways to muddy a courtroom, and his lead lawyer was already on his feet arguing that a difference in signatures proved nothing, that the note might have been signed in haste under strain, that a man's hand changes. And that was when Judge Harmon asked the question that ended it. Mr. Vance, the judge said, cutting through his own lawyer, I have a simpler question, and I'd like you to answer it yourself, not through counsel. He leaned forward. This woman claims you had 2 men steal a leather case from her home during a fire you set. She claims you did so believing it held this evidence. If that's false, if you never sent men to take it, then you never expected any evidence to exist and her account falls apart. He paused. But if it's true, if you did send men to steal a case of documents proving a forgery, then you knew the forgery existed to be proven. So which is it, sir? Did you send men to that house or did you not? The trap closed. Clara watched it close on Harlan Vance's face in real time, watched him understand a beat too late that there was no answer that saved him. If he denied sending the men, 40 witnesses from the ranch would swear otherwise, and he'd be caught in a lie under oath. If he admitted sending them, he admitted he'd known the forgery was real enough to be worth burning. Vance opened his mouth. His lead lawyer said fast and desperate, "Your Honor, my client isn't obligated to—" "I'm asking your client," Judge Harmon said, "and his silence will speak plenty." And Harlan Vance, rich and powerful and patient, who had spent 11 years and a fortune building a trap for a lonely man, stood in a packed Cheyenne courtroom and could not think of a single word to say, and his silence, exactly as the judge had promised, spoke plenty. It took the rest of the day for the law to do what the law does, slow and grinding, but the shape of it was clear before the sun went down. The note was ruled a forgery. The default order out of Willow Creek was thrown out, and Judge Coleman named for inquiry. And Judge Harmon, who did not like what he'd learned about how justice was being done in his territory, opened a formal investigation into every note Harlan Vance had bought up across the county, the whole pattern finally visible because someone had at last stood up who wasn't afraid of the man. Vance would spend the next 2 years in courtrooms. He would lose most of what he'd built, and the families across the valley whose debts he'd bought to squeeze them off their land would find one by one that the weapon he'd held over them had been knocked out of his hand. But Clara barely heard the rulings, because when Judge Harmon spoke the words that made it final when he declared the note void, in the north section, free and clear, in Brooks land now and forever, she turned to find her husband, and Nathaniel Brooks was already looking at her, and the expression on his face was one she had never seen on any human being in her whole life. It was the face of a man who had just been set free. 11 years of debt he'd carried in secret since he was a boy. 11 years of a valley's contempt. 11 years of standing alone in a yard with no one at his back. All of it gone, lifted off him in a single afternoon in a Cheyenne courtroom, and standing in the middle of that impossible lightness was the woman who'd taken it off his shoulders one careful piece at a time. He crossed the room to her. He didn't care who was watching now. That was the thing that undid her, the man who'd spent 11 years terrified of being seen, walked across a packed courtroom in front of the whole territory, and took his wife's face in both his hands like there wasn't another soul in the world. "It's over," he said. "Clara, it's really over. He can't touch us. He can't touch the land. He can't touch you." His voice broke clean in half. "You did it. You walked into my dead, cold house a month ago hating me, and you—" "We did it," Clara said. "You stood up, Nathaniel, in front of all these people. You let them see you. I couldn't have done a bit of it if you'd stayed hidden in the back like the man you used to be." "The man I used to be," Nathaniel said, "died in a burning barnyard when his wife told him she'd have chosen him." He pressed his forehead to hers right there in front of everyone, and neither of them cared. "I don't know how to thank you for what you've given me. I don't have the words. I never learned them. I only ever learned how to be alone. And you took even that away and put something so much better in its place, and I—" "Then don't thank me," Clara said. "Just come home. Take me home, Nathaniel, to our ranch, on our land, that nobody can ever take from us again." She heard herself say it. She'd said we for weeks now, but never quite that. And she watched the word land on him, watched it go all the way down into the place where he'd kept himself alone for 11 years and fill it up. "Our land," he repeated like he was learning the shape of it. "Our home," Clara said. "Our life, if you'll have it. If you'll have me, not because of a note or a bargain or a debt. My father doesn't owe a dime anymore. Nathaniel, you cleared it all weeks ago. I could walk away today and never owe you a thing." She took his hands in hers. "So understand me. There's nothing holding me here now, no debt, no bargain. Nothing but my own choosing. And I choose you, free and clear, the way you chose to give me a key to my own door the first night I came when you had every reason in the world to lock it behind me instead." And Nathaniel Brooks, in a packed Cheyenne courtroom in front of the whole staring territory, with his land won back and his name cleared and his enemy silenced behind him, pulled his wife into his arms and held her like a man who had finally, after a lifetime of winter, come all the way home. Outside, the story was already traveling faster than any wagon out across the whole territory, the way the best stories always do. The story of the rich man who lost. The story of the hated rancher who turned out to be the kindest man in the valley. And the story, most of all, of the farmer's daughter who was sold into a marriage she feared and who walked into a cold, dead house hating the man who'd bought her and who stayed to save everything he had and who somewhere along the way, without anyone's permission, least of all her own, had fallen so deeply and completely in love that she'd face down the most powerful man in the territory rather than watch him lose 1 acre of ground. They rode home the next morning, together. And when Brooks Ranch came into view at last with its mended barn and its curtained windows, and the north field lying peaceful and free, in the winter light, Clara felt Nathaniel's hand find hers on the wagon bench and hold it and not let go. And she knew all the way down that she was looking at the one thing she'd been certain a month ago she would never have again. She was looking at home. Spring came late to the valley that year, but it came, and with it came the changes that a hard winter had set in motion. Clara noticed them everywhere. She noticed them in the way people greeted Nathaniel when they rode into Willow Creek now, not with fear, not with crossed streets and pulled close children, but with nods and lifted hats and, from some, an easy familiarity that would have been unthinkable 4 months ago. She noticed them in the ranch itself, which had come alive in a way it never had in the 11 years Nathaniel had run it alone. And she noticed them most of all in her husband, who woke each morning now like a man who expected the day to be good rather than a man bracing to survive it. But the past does not let go all at once, and the valley had a long memory. It was the widow, the one whose husband's funeral Nathaniel had quietly paid for years ago, who came to the ranch first one morning in early spring with a covered basket and a nervousness she couldn't hide. "I don't rightly know how to say this," she began, standing on the porch. "So I'll just say it plain. There's talk in town about whether it's true, what your wife said in that yard and then in Cheyenne about all the things you did for folks over the years and never let on." She twisted the basket handle. "My Tom's funeral, the headstone. I always wondered where the money came from. Nobody would ever say." She looked up at him and her eyes were wet. "Was it you, Mr. Brooks? All these years, was it you?" Clara, standing in the doorway, watched her husband do the thing that told her how far he'd come. 4 months ago, he'd have deflected. I just found it. He'd have said something short and turned away and let the woman keep wondering, because being thanked had always felt to him like a debt he couldn't carry. Now he stood still and he met the widow's eyes and he said simply, "Yes, ma'am, it was." The widow's face crumpled. She set the basket down and took both his hands in hers. 10 years, she whispered. "For 10 years, I didn't know who to thank. Do you know what that does to a person? To be helped in the dark and never able to say the words back." She pressed his hands. "You took that from us, Mr. Brooks. Your kindness, you made it so we couldn't even be grateful for it. That's not kindness. That's a wall. A kind wall, but a wall all the same." Clara saw the words land on Nathaniel. She saw him take them in a way he never could have before. "I never meant it as a wall," he said low. "I know you didn't, but it was one." The widow squeezed his hands one last time and let go. "Your wife tore it down in front of the whole valley, and I came out here today to tell you I'm glad she did, because now I can finally say it." She stepped back and she said the words she'd carried for 10 years. "Thank you, Nathaniel Brooks, for my Tom. God bless you for it." And she picked up her basket and left, and Nathaniel stood on the porch for a long time after she'd gone, and when he finally turned around, his face was wet. "She's right," he said. "It was a wall the whole time. I told myself I was being humble. I was just being afraid. Afraid to let anyone close enough to owe me anything, because owing runs both ways. And if they owed me, then I might start to need them back." Clara crossed the porch and put her arms around him. "And now I got a valley full of people I let in 4 months too late," he said, "and a wife who kicked the whole wall down in an afternoon." He held her. "I spent 11 years building it, Clara. You tore it down in a month. I don't know whether to thank you or ask you how in God's name you did it." "I did it," Clara said, "because I saw something worth getting to, and I was too stubborn to let a wall stop me." They were married again in June, not because the first marriage hadn't counted. It had legally from the day her father signed those papers in a cold kitchen and broke both their hearts. But that marriage had begun in desperation and debt, and a bargain neither of them had chosen, and they both wanted one that began the other way. One that began with choosing. So on a warm morning in June in the little church in Willow Creek, in front of a valley that had once feared her husband and now filled every pew to celebrate him, Clara Whitmore married Nathaniel Brooks a second time. And this time there was no debt, no note, no father driven to a devil's bargain. This time there was only a woman who had walked into a cold house, hating a man, and a man who had never learned how to hope, standing together at an altar of their own free choosing. Her father was there. Amos Whitmore, who had aged 10 years in the months since he'd sold his daughter to save his land, and who had barely been able to look at either of them since. He came to the wedding because Clara asked him to, and he stood in the back, and Clara could see him bracing for the moment his daughter would finally publicly let him have what he'd spent months believing he deserved. She didn't. Instead, when the ceremony was done, she crossed the church to where he stood, and she took his weathered hands in hers, and she watched him flinch, waiting for the blow. "I was so angry at you," Clara said, "the night you told me. I threw the dress against the wall, and I told you that you were selling me. And I meant it. I hated you for it." Her father's face broke. "But Papa, you didn't sell me to a monster. You couldn't have known it. You made the worst bargain of your life in the dark, terrified, trying to keep a roof over Toby's head. And it turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me." She lifted his hands. "You didn't ruin my life. You gave me to the one man in this whole territory who'd have given me a key to my own door. You couldn't have known that, but that's what you did. So I'm not going to spend the rest of my life letting you carry a sin that turned into a blessing. Do you hear me? I forgive you. It's done. Let it go." Amos Whitmore, who had carried his guilt like a stone in his chest for half a year, put his face in his hands and wept. And Clara held her father in the back of the church while the whole valley pretended not to watch. And Nathaniel came and stood beside them, with his hand on the old man's shoulder. The man who'd bought his daughter and the man who'd been bought for standing together at last on the far side of a wound that had healed clean. "I don't deserve," Amos started. "Nobody's talking about deserve," Nathaniel said quietly. "I've spent my whole life keeping ledgers of who owes what. It's a poor way to live, Amos. Clara taught me that. You don't have to earn your way back to your daughter. You just have to let her love you." He squeezed the old man's shoulder. "Come out to the ranch. Bring Toby. There's more than enough room, and a boy ought to know his sister's got a home now. A real one." And Amos Whitmore looked at the man he'd once feared he was condemning his daughter to, and he understood finally all the way down that he had not damned her at all. Toby came to live with them that summer more often than not. The boy who'd whispered in the dark that the Brooks man was a killer with wolf's eyes took to Nathaniel with the fierce, uncomplicated love that only children can give, following him around the ranch, from dawn to dusk, learning to ride, learning to work cattle, learning the 1,000 small skills of a life on the land. And Clara would watch them from the porch, her little brother, and the quiet man she'd married, and she would think about the rumors that had ridden ahead of Nathaniel Brooks for 11 years, and she would marvel at how completely a lie could be undone by the simple truth of who a person actually was. "He's good with him," Clara said one evening, watching Nathaniel patiently show Toby how to mend a bridle. "You'd never know he spent his whole life alone." Elias was beside her on the porch. The old man had become something like family too over the hard winter, the one person who'd known the truth about Nathaniel Brooks all along and been ignored for 11 years. "He was always good with people," Elias said. "That was the thing that near broke my heart watching it. He had all that in him, all that gentleness, and he'd built himself a life where he never got to use a lick of it." He was quiet for a moment. "I tried to tell him, years ago. Told him he was going to wall himself up so tight he'd die alone in that house, and the whole valley would be glad." He looked at Clara. "He didn't listen to me, old stubborn fool, but he listened to you." "He didn't listen to me either," Clara said. "Not with words. I don't think words were ever going to reach him." She watched her husband ruffle Toby's hair. "I just stayed. That's all I really did, Elias. Everybody in his life either died on him or left him or wanted something from him. I just stayed, and I didn't want anything, and I wouldn't leave. And it turned out that was the one thing nobody had ever done." Elias nodded slowly. "That's the whole trick of it, isn't it?" he said. "With a man like that, you can't argue him out of 11 years of being alone. You just have to outlast it." But there was one wound left that even Clara hadn't been able to reach, and it surfaced on a night in late summer without warning, the way the deepest things always do. They were lying awake, the two of them, the way they often did now, talking in the dark, and Clara, half asleep, said something idle about the future, about children, about the family they might have. And she felt Nathaniel go still beside her in a way she'd learned over the months to recognize. "What is it?" she said, coming fully awake. "Nothing." "Nathaniel," she propped herself up, "you went somewhere just now. Where'd you go?" He was quiet for a long time. "I'm afraid," he said finally, and it cost him to say it. She could hear how much. "I'm afraid to want it. A family, children, because every single time in my life I've let myself want something that much. My mother, my father, this land, the world's tried to take it from me. And I got so good at not wanting things, Clara. 11 years of practice, and now I want everything all at once. I want you, and I want Toby running around this place, and I want children of our own someday. I want all of it so bad it scares the life out of me, because the wanting is the thing that can be used against me." Vance knew that. That's how he almost won. He found the thing I loved and he reached for it. His voice was rough in the dark. "I don't know how to want something and not be terrified of losing it. I never learned. I only ever learned how to not want anything at all." Clara lay back down and pulled him against her, and she held the great and terrible Nathaniel Brooks in the dark the way you'd hold a frightened child. "You want to know the truth," she said. "The thing I've never told you. Tell me." "I'm terrified too." She felt him shift in surprise. "You think I don't lie awake sometimes and think about the drought that ruined my family and the fever that near took Toby and how fast a whole life can be swept out from under you? I know exactly how it feels to lose everything, Nathaniel. I've done it. I watched my father lose the farm one dry season at a time." Her arms tightened around him. "The difference between us isn't that I'm not afraid. It's that I decided the wanting was worth the fear. That's all. That's the only difference. I looked at a life of protecting myself by never loving anything, and I looked at a life of loving everything and being scared out of my mind, and I chose the second one. On purpose, with my eyes open." She pressed her lips to his shoulder. "You don't have to stop being afraid, my love. You just have to decide the way I did that it's worth it anyway. And then you have to decide it again tomorrow, and the day after. That's the whole secret. That's all courage ever is, deciding it's worth it over and over, even scared." Nathaniel was silent for a long, long moment in the dark, and then he turned in her arms and he held her face in his hands the way he had that first night in Cheyenne, and he said the words like a vow. "Then I decide it's worth it," he said. "You, Toby, children someday, this land, all of it. I decide it's worth being afraid for, and I'll decide it again tomorrow and every day after for the rest of my life. Because a life without you in it isn't safer, Clara. I understand that now. It's just an emptier. And I spent 11 years calling that empty house safe when all it ever was lonely." Clara kissed him in the dark. And outside the valley slept, and the north field lay peaceful under the summer stars, and the two of them lay wrapped together in a house that had once been the coldest place either of them had ever entered, and was now against all the odds the world had stacked against it, the warmest. Oh yeah, the years were good to them. Their first child, a daughter, came the following spring, and they named her for Nathaniel's mother. And the first time Clara laid the baby in her husband's arms, she watched a man who had spent 11 years certain he was not allowed to need anyone come completely and finally undone. Nathaniel Brooks, who did not know how to smile when Clara met him, sat holding his infant daughter with tears running openly down his weathered face, and he did not try to hide them, and he did not fold them away. And Clara understood that the last of the wall had finally come down for good. A son followed 2 years later, and the ranch that had been silent for 11 years filled up with the noise of a family with children's voices and running feet and all the beautiful chaos that Nathaniel had once believed was not for men like him. Harlan Vance was never a threat again. The investigation Judge Harmon opened in Cheyenne ground on for 2 years and stripped him of nearly everything. The bought notes were voided. One by one, the families he'd squeezed were freed, and the man himself left the territory, eventually quiet and diminished, a cautionary tale that mothers in the valley told their children about what happens to men who mistake cruelty for strength. Clara never once thought of him without also thinking of the yard full of people who'd stood between him and her husband, and she understood that Vance's real defeat had never been in a courtroom at all. It had been the moment a whole valley finally saw Nathaniel Brooks clearly and chose him. Elias lived long enough to teach both children to ride and to sit on the porch on summer evenings, telling them stories about how their father had been the most feared man in the valley and the gentlest both at once, and how nobody had understood it until their mother came along and made everyone see. He died peaceful, an old man in a bed at Brooks Ranch with the family he'd found late in life around him, and Nathaniel buried him in the north field beside his own parents in ground that no one would ever take because Elias had been family, and family belonged in that soil. And Amos Whitmore lived to see his daughter happier than he'd ever dared hope, and to bounce his grandchildren on his knee, and to make his peace before the end with the terrible bargain that had turned out to be the truest gift he'd ever given her. He and Nathaniel became in the years that followed something like friends, two quiet men who understood each other's silences, bound together by the woman they both loved. Many years later, when her hair had gone gray and the children were grown and gone to lives of their own, Clara stood on the porch of Brooks Ranch at sunset, and Nathaniel came and stood beside her the way he had 10,000 times, and put his arm around her, and the two of them watched the light go down over the land that had once felt to her like a prison. "Do you ever think about it?" she asked. "The night you first came into that house and told me you'd never make me do anything." "Every day of my life," Nathaniel said. "It's the smartest thing I ever did. Though I didn't know it then. I thought I was just being decent. I didn't know I was giving you a reason to choose me." "You gave me the key to my own door," Clara said. "That first night, when you had every reason in the world to lock it behind me instead." "That's the moment, Nathaniel. That's when it started. A woman doesn't fall in love with a man who owns her, but a man who hands her the key to her own freedom and means it." She leaned into him. "That's a different thing entirely." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, looking out at the land. "I asked you a question once," he said, "long time ago, when I still couldn't quite believe you weren't going to wake up one morning and leave. I asked you if you could choose again, would you still marry me?" "I remember. You never really answered." Clara turned to look at her husband, at the face that had frightened a whole valley for 11 years, that had learned to smile, and then to laugh, and then to weep openly, holding his children, at the man who'd walked into a Cheyenne courtroom, terrified of being seen, and let the whole territory see him anyway, all for her. "I didn't answer because it wasn't a real question," she said. "There was never a version of my life where I'd have chosen anything else. Not once I knew you." She took his face in her hands the way she had in a burning barnyard a lifetime ago, the way she always would. "I was forced into a marriage I feared, Nathaniel Brooks. I came to your house hating you, certain my life was over. And you didn't win my heart with promises or with your money or with a single thing you were supposed to. You won it by handing me my freedom and trusting me to choose you with it." Her eyes filled. "So yes, if I could choose again, knowing everything, the fear and the storm and Vance and all of it, I would choose you. Every single time, in every life I was ever given. I would walk into that cold house and I would choose you." And Nathaniel Brooks pulled his wife into his arms on the porch of the home they'd built out of a ruin on the land that no one would ever take from them, and he held her while the sun went down over everything they'd fought for and won. The woman who had once been sold to settle a debt had become the freest woman in the valley, free because she had chosen with her own two eyes open the one man wise enough to know that love given freely is the only love worth having at all. And the man who had spent his whole life believing he was not allowed to need anyone had learned at last and forever the simplest and hardest truth there is, that he had never been strong because he stood alone. He had only been alone. And the day a farmer's daughter threw a wedding dress against a wall, rather than be sold and then walked into his life and refused to leave it, was the day the strongest, loneliest, most misunderstood man in the whole territory finally truly came home. She had feared a cowboy. She had married a stranger, and she had spent the rest of her life beside the gentlest heart she would ever know, the one she'd have chosen freely and forever every single time.